There is a question you were told to stop asking somewhere around the age of 6. Not because it was a bad question, but because the adults around you ran out of answers. The question is why? Why do we do it this way? Why does it matter? Why should anyone care? Most of us learn to trade that question for more respectable ones. What are we making? How do we make it? When will it ship? What does it cost? Those questions have answers. Those answers can be measured. And measured answers are comfortable. But here is the strange thing that Simon Sinek noticed, and that has kept people arguing about his book for well over a decade now. The organizations and the individuals who move us, the ones who command loyalty that seems out of all proportion to what they actually sell, the ones whose customers argue on their behalf for free, the ones whose employees will forgive them mistakes they would never forgive anyone else, those people almost never lead with what. They lead with why. And the ones who lead with what, no matter how good the what is, tend to find themselves competing forever on price, on features, on being slightly better than the next option, and wondering why nobody loves them. That is the whole thesis, and I want to be honest with you up front. It is a simple thesis. It fits on a napkin. It is the kind of idea that a skeptical person can dismiss in about 4 seconds as a motivational poster with footnotes. I have some sympathy for that skepticism, and we will get to it before we are done, because I do not think you can take this book seriously without also taking its critics seriously. But I want to make a case for spending the next stretch of time with it anyway. Because underneath the napkin diagram there is something genuinely uncomfortable being asked of you. Sinek is not really asking you to write a mission statement. He is asking whether you actually believe anything, whether there is a reason you get up that would survive the removal of your job title, your product, your metrics, and your quarterly targets. Most of us have never had to answer that. And the book's suggestion is that this unanswered question is precisely why so much of modern work feels like effort without meaning, and so much of modern leadership feels like management wearing a costume. So let us start where the book starts. Not with what great leaders do. With why anyone follows them at all. Start with Why, How Great Leaders Inspire Everyone to Take Action was published in 2009 by Simon Sinek. That date matters more than a date usually does. 2009 was the bottom of a global financial crisis, a moment when a great many people looked at institutions they had trusted, at leaders who had been very good at explaining what they did and how they did it, and discovered that nobody in the building could articulate why any of it should exist. Confidence had collapsed. And into that vacuum arrived a book arguing that confidence is not built on competence. It is built on belief. Sinek came to this from marketing and consulting rather than from the academy, and you can feel that in the book's DNA. It is not a research monograph. It does not run regressions. It is a work of pattern noticing, an author holding up a series of stories, some famous and some obscure, and saying, look, the same shape keeps appearing. He is candid that the origin was personal. He describes having lost his own passion for his work, having become someone who could do the job perfectly well and could no longer say what it was for, and having gone looking for the thing he had misplaced. The book is, in a real sense, the record of that search generalized outward. The book became inseparable from the talk. Sinek gave a TED presentation on the same idea that went on to become one of the most watched talks ever recorded, and for millions of people the 18 minutes came first and the book came second, or never came at all. That is worth naming because it created a strange situation. The idea achieved enormous cultural penetration in a compressed form, which meant an enormous number of people who think they know this book only know its diagram. The book has arguments the diagram does not contain, including arguments about why the diagram is so easy to get wrong. And it endured commercially in a way that most business books simply do not. According to NPD Bookscan's ranking covering mid-June 2016 through mid-June 2017, that is 7 and 8 years after publication, Start With Why was the best-selling leadership book of that period, moving 171,000 paperback copies. Business books are usually a spike and then a long silence. This one had a second life and a third, largely by word of mouth, which is either a nice piece of evidence for its own thesis or a nice piece of irony, depending on your mood. Sinek later extended the framework across further books, most notably The Infinite Game, which pushes at what happens when you take a long enough view of purpose that winning stops being a coherent goal. But start with why is the foundation stone, and it is the one worth understanding properly, because everything after it assumes you have accepted its central claim. Here is the diagram, and I will describe it carefully because you cannot see it. Picture 3 concentric circles, like a bullseye, or like the rings inside a cut onion. The outermost ring is labeled what? That ring holds the things every organization can describe without difficulty: the products, the services, the outputs, the deliverables. What we make, what we sell, what we do. Everyone knows their what. Inside that ring is a second ring, labeled how. This is the ring of process and method, the differentiators, the proprietary approach, the value proposition, the thing you say when someone asks what makes you different. Some organizations know their how. Fewer than know their what, but plenty. And at the center, in the innermost circle, is why. And Sinek is emphatic about what this word does not mean. Why is not to make money. Profit is a result, not a reason. It is the outcome of the thing, not the thing. Why means purpose, cause, belief. The reason your organization exists beyond the transaction. The reason anyone in it should care whether it survives. Very few people or organizations can articulate this. Almost all of them think they can. Now the actual argument, which is not about the circles, but about direction of travel. Everyone communicates from the outside in. It is the natural gravitational path. We start with what, because what is the easiest thing to say and the easiest thing to prove. Then, if we are sophisticated, we move to how. And why, if it appears at all, appears as a kind of decorative flourish in the last slide of the deck. The inspiring ones invert this. They go inside out. They start at the center, with the belief, and they let the how and the what arrive afterward as evidence of the belief rather than as arguments for it. And the claim Sinek makes, the claim that turns a diagram into a thesis, is that this ordering is not a stylistic preference. It changes what the message actually does inside the person hearing it. Think about what an outside-in message asks of you. It presents facts and invites you to evaluate them. It puts you in the posture of a judge. You weigh, you compare, you look for the flaw, you check the price against the alternative. It is an inherently adversarial posture, and it is why so much selling feels like combat. An inside-out message does something different. It states a belief and, in doing so, asks a single question: do you believe this too? It is not asking you to evaluate. It is asking you to identify. And if the answer is yes, everything that follows lands in a fundamentally different way, because you are no longer assessing a claim from outside. You are recognizing something from inside. The facts stop being arguments to be defeated and become confirmations of something you already decided. That is the whole mechanism. It is disarmingly small. Its consequences are not. Before the circles, though, the book opens somewhere else, and I think this opening is the most underrated part of it. Sinek argues there are only 2 ways to get a human being to do something. Only 2. You can manipulate them or you can inspire them. Now, he uses manipulation without much moral heat, which surprises people. He is not calling anyone a villain. He means it almost technically. A manipulation is any external lever you pull to produce a behavior, where the behavior stops when the lever stops. And once he lists them, you will start seeing them everywhere, in your inbox, in your feed, and this is the uncomfortable part, in your own mouth. Price, dropped until the objection goes away. Promotions, offers, the deal that expires at midnight. Fear, which is the most reliable lever ever discovered, because a frightened person will act to end the fear and will not audit the reasoning. Aspiration, its mirror image, which sells you the person you wish you were. Peer pressure, the quiet suggestion that everyone else has already decided. And novelty, dressed up as innovation, which is really just a new feature announced loudly enough to be mistaken for a new reason. Here is Sinek's point, and it is sharper than it first appears. Manipulations work. That is not the criticism. They work reliably, they work fast, and they are measurable, which is exactly why organizations become addicted to them. The criticism is about what they cost and what they fail to build. They cost money because every manipulation must be renewed. A discount trains a customer to wait for the next discount. Fear must be refreshed before it fades. Novelty must be topped up as it becomes ordinary. The lever must be pulled again, and each pull is more expensive than the last because tolerance builds. You end up on a treadmill you paid to install. And what they fail to build is loyalty. Sinek draws a hard line between repeat business and loyalty, and it is a line most companies never notice they have crossed. Repeat business is someone transacting with you multiple times. Loyalty is someone turning down a better offer to stay with you. Those look identical on a dashboard right up until the moment a competitor undercuts you, and then one of them evaporates and the other does not. Manipulation buys the first and cannot buy the second at any price. Because a customer acquired by a lever belongs to whoever holds the biggest lever, and there is always someone willing to hold a bigger one. Inspiration is the alternative, and it is defined by exactly this. The behavior continues when nobody is pulling anything. The person acts because of something inside them, not because of something you did to them. That is not a nicer way to sell. It is a structurally different asset. One is rented. The other is owned. And Sinek is pointed about the world this has produced, a landscape of institutions that have become extraordinarily skilled at pulling levers and correspondingly incapable of giving anyone a reason. He is direct that this is a problem beyond commerce, that a society trained entirely on manipulation loses the capacity to be called toward anything, and that when large problems need collective effort, having only levers and no reasons is a genuine civic emergency. He extends this to leadership at national scale, and to how much of our attention now lives inside devices engineered, with great precision, to pull exactly these levers. So why should the order of words matter this much? Here Sinek reaches for biology, and here I want to be careful with you, because this is the part of the book that has attracted the most legitimate criticism, and I do not want to oversell it. He points to the structure of the brain. The neocortex, the newer, outer layer, handles rational and analytical thought and language. It is where facts and figures land. It corresponds, in his mapping, to the outer what ring. Beneath it sit the limbic structures, older, responsible for feeling, for trust, for loyalty, and crucially for decision-making. And, he emphasizes, the limbic brain has no capacity for language. The mapping is elegant. When you communicate outside in, you are speaking to the neocortex, you are delivering facts to the part of the brain that can process facts, but does not drive behavior. People will understand you completely, agree with every point, and not move. When you communicate inside out, you are speaking to the part that actually decides. And this, he argues, explains one of the most common and most maddening experiences in all of business. The customer who says the decision just felt right and cannot tell you why. Or the one who says, correctly, that everything checks out on paper and they are still not comfortable. That is not irrationality. That is a decision being made in a region that has no words to explain itself, and then being handed to the neocortex to rationalize after the fact. The gut feeling is not the absence of reasoning. It is reasoning without a vocabulary. Now, the caution. Sinek himself frames this as speculation about biological factors, and neuroscientists have been fairly unimpressed with the tidiness of it. The brain is not three obliging layers that correspond to three obliging circles. The limbic system is not a discrete purpose organ. Any model this clean is doing more explaining than the underlying anatomy can support. But here is what I would say in the book's defense, and I think it matters. The biology in Start with Why is not load-bearing. It is a metaphor recruited to explain a pattern the author had already observed. Delete the neuroscience entirely and the observable claim stands untouched, that people decide on grounds they cannot articulate, that facts alone reliably fail to move them, and that messages which begin with belief perform differently than messages which begin with evidence. Anyone who has ever lost a negotiation on points and won it on rapport knows this is true. The book's error is in reaching for a mechanism it did not need and could not properly support. Treat the brain chapter as illustration, not as proof, and you lose nothing. The story that best carries the argument is about the invention of powered flight, and it is a story about two competitors who could not have been less evenly matched. Samuel Pierpont Langley had every advantage a person could have. He had money, substantial government funding. He had access, moving comfortably among the powerful and the well-connected. He could hire the best minds available and did. He had the press, who followed his work closely and expected him to win. He was, by every measure a modern investor would apply, the obvious bet. In Dayton, Ohio, two brothers ran a bicycle shop. Wilbur and Orville Wright had no funding worth the name, no college degrees, no connections, and no press. Their team was assembled from whoever was around. Nobody was watching. And the Wrights flew first. Sinek's reading of this is that the decisive difference was not resources or intelligence. It was what each party was chasing. Langley, on this telling, was pursuing an outcome, the fame, the achievement, being the man who did it. The Wrights were pursuing a cause. They believed the machine would change the world, and they wanted the world changed. That belief was not a slogan. It organized their behavior. It kept a small underfunded team failing repeatedly, in public, for years, and coming back, because you cannot embarrass someone out of a belief the way you can embarrass them out of an ambition. And the detail that makes the story land, is what happened afterward. When the Wrights flew, Langley quit. Not because the goal had become impossible. Powered flight had just been proven possible. The field was wide open. The engineering was young. There was an entire century of aviation waiting to be built. He quit because he could no longer be first. Which reveals, retroactively, what he had actually been doing the whole time. If your why is to be first, then someone else being first ends you. If your why is that the thing should exist, someone else achieving it is not defeat. It is progress, and you keep going. I find this the most quietly devastating passage in the book, because the test it implies is one almost nobody passes. Ask yourself, if a competitor solved the problem you are working on tomorrow, and solved it well, and got all the credit, would you be relieved that the problem was solved, or would you be finished? The answer tells you what you have actually been chasing, regardless of what your website says. And most of us do not enjoy the answer. The book's central case study is Apple, and Sinek uses it in a specific way that is worth getting right, because it is routinely misunderstood. The setup is a puzzle rather than a compliment. Apple is not uniquely resourced. It buys components from the same suppliers, hires from the same talent pool, works with the same agencies and the same manufacturers as its competitors. Everything that is available to Apple is available to everyone else. So why does the same set of ingredients keep producing a wildly different result, and keep producing it across category after category, in music and phones and computers, categories that have nothing technically in common? His answer is clarity of why. Apple, in his reading, is not a computer company that occasionally makes other things. It is an organization that exists to challenge the established order and to hand power to individuals, and computers were simply the first place that belief found expression. Which is why nobody blinked when it made a music player, and nobody blinked when it made a phone. The belief did not move. Only the medium did. And then he runs a small thought experiment that does more work than pages of argument. Take a conventional Apple advertisement written outside in. We make great computers. They are beautifully designed and easy to use. Want to buy one? Every word is true. Every word is defensible. And it is completely inert. You feel nothing. It is a competent claim that invites you to compare it against other competent claims. Now invert it. Everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. The way we do that is by making our products beautifully designed and simple to use. We happen to make great computers. Want to buy one? Identical facts. Identical products. Nothing has been added. Only the sequence has changed, and the second one does something to you that the first one does not, and that difference is the entire book compressed into 2 paragraphs. The reason this matters commercially is what it makes possible. When customers buy the why rather than the what, the organization can move. It can enter a category it has never touched and be trusted there, because it is not asking permission to sell a new object, it is expressing the same belief through a new object, and the audience already signed up for the belief. Competitors defined by their what cannot follow. A computer company making a phone is a stretch that must be justified. A challenger of orthodoxy making a phone is Tuesday. None of this is worth anything if it stops with the message, and this is where Sinek's third part turns the argument from marketing into something harder. The claim is that trust is the actual currency, and that trust cannot be manufactured through communication alone. Trust emerges when people sense that you are acting from a genuine belief rather than performing one for their benefit. Which means the why has to be real, and it has to be visible in behavior nobody was supposed to be watching, or the entire mechanism inverts. A stated why that the organization does not live becomes worse than no stated why at all. It becomes evidence that you are willing to fake sincerity, which is the one thing people never forgive. The practical consequence is a hiring argument, and it is the most immediately actionable idea in the book. If you hire for skill, you get people who can do the job and who are, by construction, available to anyone offering more money, because you selected for a tradable attribute and someone will always outbid you for it. If you hire people who believe what you believe, you get people whose reasons for being there are not for sale. Skill can be taught. Belief cannot be installed. So select for the thing you cannot install and train the thing you can, rather than the reverse, which is what nearly every job posting in existence does. Sinek then borrows Everett Rogers's law of diffusion of innovation to explain how belief actually travels through a population. The distribution splits into roughly 2.5% innovators, 13.5% early adopters, 34% early majority, 34% late majority, and 16% laggards. The early groups are the ones who will act on belief. They will buy on faith, tolerate imperfection, and pay a premium to be part of something before it is proven. The majority will not. The majority waits until someone they trust has gone first. They are not buying your product, they are buying the recommendation of the early adopter next to them. Which means the sequence is not optional. You cannot reach the majority directly, however good your product is, because the majority is not listening to you. It is listening to the people you have already inspired. Somewhere in the 15 to 18% range the system tips and the majority begins to follow, but only if the left side of the curve has been won first, on belief, before the proof existed. This reframes a failure mode that companies experience constantly and misdiagnose every time. A product tests well, reviews well, wins its category on the merits, and never crosses into the mainstream. The post-mortem blames the marketing budget or the timing. Sinek's reading is that it gave the early adopters nothing to believe in, so it never earned the endorsement that the majority was actually waiting for. It was a very good what, addressed to an audience that only moves on why. The book's fifth part contains its least comfortable idea, and it is the one I would keep if I could keep only one. Sinek argues that the greatest threat to an organization is not failure. It is success. And he calls the mechanism the split. It works like this. In the early days, the why does not need to be written down, because the founder is standing in the room. Every decision is filtered through a person who holds the belief in their body. Nobody has to interpret a document, they just watch what the founder does when something goes wrong, and they learn. Then the thing works. It grows. And growth is a volume problem, so the organization does the only sensible thing: it builds systems. It hires managers to run the systems. It builds metrics to check the systems. And every one of those artifacts is necessarily a what or a how, because those are the only things that can be systematized. You cannot write a process for belief. You can only write a process for behavior. Slowly, and nobody notices the day it happens, the what detaches from the why. The company keeps executing brilliantly. The dashboards look better than ever. And it is now a machine that produces outputs, with no living memory of what the outputs were for. The founder, if still present, becomes a kind of ceremonial object, invoked in onboarding decks, ignored in planning meetings. The symptom Sinek identifies is beautifully precise. The organization starts measuring what it does and stops being able to say why. And, because the measurements are excellent, everyone concludes things are fine. The split is invisible from inside because every individual instrument reads green. His answer is not to resist growth, which would be silly. It is that the why must be translated out of the founder's head and into the institution before the founder's presence stops being enough, and that this translation is the single most important act of leadership in a scaling organization. And the one that is almost never scheduled, because it is not urgent on any day in particular until it is permanently too late. He points at Walmart as the shape of the problem. Sam Walton, on Sinek's reading, was driven by a belief about serving people. What survived him was a machine optimized for low prices. Low price had been the expression of the belief. Then the belief left, and the expression remained, and the expression, running by itself with nothing behind it, became something Walton would not have recognized. The what outlived the why, and kept running, and that is precisely what makes it dangerous. A company that has lost its why does not stop. It accelerates, because there is nothing left to slow it down. The last movement of the book asks the obvious question. If a why is so valuable, where do you get one? And the answer is genuinely counterintuitive. You do not get one. You cannot invent a why, because a why is not aspirational. It is not who you intend to become. It is not a vision statement produced in an offsite by people with markers. A why is archaeological. It already happened. It is a pattern in a past you have already lived, and the work is not creation but excavation. For a person, this means looking backward at the moments you were most alive, the work you did that did not feel like work, the things you defended when defending them cost you something. The pattern in those moments, the constant across situations that had nothing else in common, is the thing. You are not choosing it. You are noticing it. Which is why a why cannot really be wrong, and also why it cannot be changed to be more marketable. It is a fact about you, not a decision by you. For an organization, the excavation happens in the founding. Not the business plan, the frustration. Why did someone go to the trouble? What was so intolerable about the way things were that a person built an entire institution to be a rebuttal to it? That original grievance, that specific intolerance, is usually the why, and it is usually still sitting in the company's own early history unread. And then Sinek offers the one practical instrument in the book, which he calls the celery test. Imagine you are at a dinner party and everyone gives you advice about what to buy at the store. One says rice milk. One says Oreos. One says celery. One says M&Ms. You go to the store, and you buy all four, because everyone was an expert, and you did not want to disregard anyone. You have now wasted money, wasted time, and here is the actual point. A stranger watching you in the checkout line has no idea what you believe. The cart is incoherent. It is a cart assembled by consensus, which is another way of saying it is a cart assembled by nobody. Now suppose your why is that you believe in doing only what is healthy. You walk past the M&Ms, you walk past the Oreos. You buy the celery and the rice milk. And now the stranger watching you does not need to be told anything. Your filter is legible from across the room, from the outside, in 4 seconds, without a word. That is the test, and it is a decision rule rather than an inspirational thought. Every opportunity gets held against the why, and the ones that do not pass get declined, not because they are bad opportunities, but because a cart that contains everything communicates nothing. The value of a why is measured almost entirely in what it lets you refuse. An organization that never turns down a good opportunity does not have a why. It has a wish. I promised we would take the objections seriously, and there are real ones. The most substantive is the selection problem. The book is built almost entirely on stories chosen because they worked: Apple, the Wrights, King, Kennedy. But there is a vast unmarked graveyard of organizations that had a blazing sense of purpose, communicated it beautifully, inspired everyone in earshot, and died anyway, because the product was bad or the timing was wrong or they ran out of money. Those companies did not get chapters. And when your evidence consists exclusively of survivors, you can prove almost anything about why they survived. Why may be necessary. This book does not establish that it is sufficient, and it sometimes reads as though it does. There is the neuroscience, which we have already covered. The brain model is tidier than the brain. And there is a specific, useful challenge from Ken Krogh, writing in Forbes, who argued that for salespeople the sequence has a missing first term. His position was that great salespeople start with who, that finding the right person comes before anything else, and that the most compelling why in the world lands as nothing if it lands on someone who is never going to care. Then he was clear. Once you have the right who, Sinek is spot on. Beginning with why is a genuine game changer. It is a friendly amendment rather than a demolition, and it corrects something real. A why is not a magic solvent that works on all audiences. It is a filter that sorts the ones who share it from the ones who do not, which means the sorting matters as much as the message. On the other side, there is convergent support. Lindsay McGregor and Neil Doshi, writing in Prime to Perform, arrived at a related conclusion from a more empirical direction and put it in a line worth carrying: why we work determines how well we work. Different method, same territory, which is at least weak evidence that Sinek was pointing at something and not at nothing. My honest reading, having sat with all of it, the book is a strong lens and a weak proof. Do not take it as a theory that predicts outcomes. Take it as a question that improves your decisions. Those are different things, and the book's real failure is that it sometimes forgets which one it is. Let me consolidate what I think survives. There are only two ways to move a human being. Manipulation, which works and must be paid for again every single time, and inspiration, which continues when nobody is pulling anything. Everything expensive about modern business lives in the gap between them. The order of your message is not cosmetic. Every organization can state its what. Fewer can state their how. Almost none can state their why, and almost all of them believe they can. Communicating from the inside out asks people to identify rather than evaluate, and those are different mental acts with different outcomes. Profit is not a why. It is a result. An organization that cannot distinguish between the reason it exists and the outcome of existing has already lost the plot and does not yet know it. Loyalty and repeat business are not the same thing, and they look identical on a dashboard until a competitor undercuts you, at which point exactly one of them survives. Hire for belief and train for skill, because skill can be installed and belief cannot, and people hired for a tradable attribute will always be tradable. Belief travels through populations in a fixed sequence. You cannot address the majority directly. You win the left side of the curve on faith, before the proof exists, and the majority follows the people you inspired rather than following you. Success is more dangerous than failure. Growth forces systematization. Systems can only encode what and how, and so the split, the quiet detachment of the machine from its reason, is the default outcome of winning, not a rare accident. It is invisible from inside because all the instruments read green. A why is excavated, not invented. It is in your past, not your ambitions. And its entire value shows up in what it lets you refuse. And the Langley test, which I would keep above all the others. If someone else achieved your goal tomorrow and took all the credit, would you be relieved, or would you be finished? Whatever you answer is what you have actually been doing, no matter what you have been saying. I want to end with the thing the book does not quite say out loud. Start with why is filed under leadership, and it will be shelved next to 100 other volumes about how to run a company better. But I do not think it is really a business book, and I do not think its most important reader is a chief executive. I think it is a book about a very ordinary and very widespread condition, which is the condition of being extremely competent at something you can no longer justify. That condition is not exotic. It is close to universal, and it is nearly always invisible, because competence is a very good disguise. The work gets done. The numbers hold. Nobody complains. And somewhere underneath, a person is executing a what with no live connection to a why, and calling the resulting flatness burnout, or a rough patch, or just the way work is. The book's origin story is exactly this: an author who had lost the reason and had not lost the ability, and who found that the second one cannot substitute for the first for very long. So the invitation is not to write a purpose statement. It is smaller and more difficult than that. It is to look honestly at the cart you are currently pushing and ask whether a stranger could tell what you believe by looking at it. Not by reading your bio. By looking at what you actually said yes to and what you actually declined over the last year, when it cost you something to decline. If the cart is coherent, you already have a why, and you may simply have stopped saying it. If the cart contains celery and Oreos and rice milk and M&Ms, that is not a failure of character. It is what happens to everyone who takes every good opportunity, which is the most reasonable-looking way there is to end up standing for nothing in particular. The question you were told to stop asking at 6 was not childish. It was the last time anyone asked you for a reason instead of a result. You are allowed to ask it again. You will find that most of the people around you cannot answer it, and that this is not because they are shallow, but because nobody has required it of them in decades. Start there. Not with what you are going to do about it. Not with how. Just with why, and be prepared for the possibility that the honest answer is that you do not know yet, which is a far better place to stand than a confident answer you assembled to sound good in a meeting. The why was never something you have to build. It is something you have to stop drowning out.